Yes, we should.
Welcome to the July 25th session of the Historic Preservation Commission. The agenda for this meeting was posted no later than July 19th, Tuesday, on the bulletin board outside of City Hall. May I have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Morgan?
Here.
Commissioner Shire?
Here.
Commissioner Tofranken is not here. Commissioner Vartanian?
Here.
And Chairperson Vidor.
Here. We'll go right into the review and approval of the minutes from the last meeting.
Two, actually.
Okay.
Oh, right, two of us.
Yes,
Sorry,
sir.
I thought you had two comments. No, I just had a quick correction on 330 Kempton Road. And we have it noted as Commissioner Tufenkian moved to approve and Commissioner Vartanian seconded. I believe I made the motion. We could please just
Switch.
switch.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone else?
No.
No? Okay. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Okay. I will abstain. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Oh, roll call.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
roll call.
Okay.
Take the roll call.
Commissioner Morgan?
Yes.
Commissioner Shire?
Abstain.
Commissioner Vartanian?
Yes.
Oral communications. Discussion is limited to items not a part of this agenda. Each speaker is limited to 5 minutes, and the commission may question speakers, but there is no debate or decision. If anyone has a card they want to submit, now would be the time. I don't think we have any oral communications, so we'll move right into comments from commissioners. And maybe we'll start on this side. So, Mr. Morgan, do you have any comments?
Other than what we are doing today, I think it's a great plan. So
Nothing new.
Nothing new?
I have no comments at this time. Thank you.
Okay, I have a short announcement, which is just to report, and this is kind of a save the date for everybody, that this year the Glendale Historical Society is going to have its annual fall home tour on October 2nd, Sunday, from 11 to 4 p.m., and the tour is called Glendale Gems, Historic Homes of the Jewel City. So details will be coming to us by the start of August, either on the Historical Society's website, or you'll be able to call 818-242-7447. But we understand that this tour is going to feature designated landmarks of the city of Glendale. So October 2nd, 11 to 4, mark your calendar for a great home tour. Thank you. So now we can move on to old business, which is consideration of any commissioner-generated proposals for future discussion regarding HPC policies or goals. So if anyone has any new topics they want to bring up, this would be the time. Anyone?
I have
No?
nothing at this time.
Yeah.
Okay.
We didn't agendize anything for this meeting because we wanted the bulk of the meeting
Right.
to go over the community plan. But for next month, research permitting, we're going to be discussing the regulation of interior spaces on Glendale Register properties. So we're doing some research now and should have a report.
Thank you. Okay, so we can move on to item 7, new business, and the first order of business is Brand Park, the advisory review of proposed gates at the entry points from Mountain Street. So I think,
Just to introduce this, that Lila can get set up. This kind of is an interesting discussion because we'll also be discussing today the possibility of designating the El Miradero Gate as well as the possibility of designating Brand Park. But as of now, they're not designated, as you know, so this is an advisory kind of review, and the Parks Department is the lead agency on this. Lila Batar is the designer on the project, and so they'll welcome any comments that you have, but they're not bound to make any changes. So,
thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Vidor, members of the Commission.
I tried to move this, but it's not.
If you use the arrow key toward the right bottom.
It's not moving.
Okay. Let me. Okay. There. Just use the arrows.
The thought to install gates at Brand Park came as a response to security concerns that were generated by the surrounding neighbors to the different security measures in the park. And I think that basically the security concerns were highlighted 3 years ago when an incident happened in the park, stabbing incident. The city followed with some workshop with the residents and came up with various security measures. Installing the gates on Mountain was part of the security measures that were developed at that time. I want to start the presentation by showing you a few slides on the evolution of the gateway at Brand Park. The original gateway at Brand Park was made of the stone pilasters and the wrought iron archway. And this, I believe, was built with the Brand Castle and was changed in 1913. When the east wing was added at the castle in 1913, the gateway was built as well. And if you see, and actually I wanted to point out one more thing. If you look at this, this area shows the center section with the palm trees that we all take into consideration that they are the historic planting, landscaping of the era. Then this shows an aerial circa 1920, and you see that, again, central axis, that gateway at let me point out to it again in here, and you see the fencing on the side. I also included for you circa 1950, the same situation. Oops, I messed up something. Okay, sorry. Again, the same gateway, the planting is a little higher, but that gateway remained. And then, I believe in the late 60s, a new changes were made to that area where we have a new entrance and exits to the park, and we have also a west gate that was open. We were looking at basically designing gates in the east and the west location in the park. And the gates were mainly, the height of the gates was to work with the height of fencing that we have in that area. Here's some of the fencing. The fencing is relatively low, so the gates, the main purpose of the gates is to keep cars from coming into the park after closing hours. It wasn't intended to keep people from coming into the park, because they could anyway cross over the existing fence. In the plan layout of the gates, we found that there was one of the challenges that we had to deal with is even though when you look at the gates, when you look at the overall view of the gates, they look symmetrical, but actually they were not symmetrical. They were somewhat balanced. So we had to lay out these gates in a manner that gives that balance as well. We reset the gates in the back to give more hierarchy to historic gates. And as I said here, we also we had one of the challenges are the palm trees, the landscaping with the area that we had to work with in laying out the fencing and the gates in there. On the west side of the park, we have a rolling gate that opens up behind the fencing, the concrete fencing in the park. So when the gate is open, it would not be visible from the street. Here's a view of the main gate, and it shows the two east and west section. That's the east and west section of the gates. And again, the height ties with the existing historic gates. Here's a rendering of the elevation of those gates. And what we tried we met with Jay Platt, and we looked at what vocabulary to use. And what we did is we maintained the height of the gates, and we picked some of the elements like as the pickets, some of the horizontal members, and we worked with our consultant, Lawrence Moss, our local landscape architect, in doing the design of the gates. Here's a feel of the side fencing on the gate. And this is the west gate design. This is a section on the west gate that shows this is the concrete wall, the fence, existing fence, and this is the gate which would be rolling behind the existing fence. Another item I wanted to bring to your attention, see if you have any objection or feedback on it, is the planters in the center median. These planters, concern came from our maintenance staff to the maintenance of those planters. And if we look at the original intention of the design of that roadway and the gate, it was getting a main access to seeing the castle, the Prant Castle, what was called at that time. And
Lila, the planters weren't agendized as part of this, so we shouldn't talk about them. They're kind of part of the addition era, so we need to have a full presentation for that.
Okay, so then that concludes my presentation. Any questions?
What are the height of the gates?
I'm sorry?
What are the height of the gates?
The gate's about 4 feet 9 inches to,
Goes from like 4'6" to 5'3",
Yeah.
I think.
So the entire new fencing structure that is proposed is 4'9".
actually,
Goes
these
from
gates
5'6"
are
to
about
4'6".
4 foot 9 inches. So we start with the fencing at 4 foot 9, and then we go back. But because the grade goes up, the gates end up at 4'6".
And the idea was to take the historic wrought iron gates and use that height, the horizontal line, as a module, not to try to replicate any of this fancy scroll work on the top.
Yes.
And then to just keep the lines relatively simple.
Do any of the commissioners have any questions for Ms. Bitar?
In terms of the landscaping changes in general, we did not make that many revisions to the landscaping. There's only bird of paradise in this area next to the palm trees. We will be removing those birds of paradise, but the rest remains.
And the way I understand it is none of the fencing that's being installed is actually affixed to the historic columns that comprise the entryway. They're all kind
Set
of
back
flush,
few inches.
few inches
Yeah,
away.
we'll set them back a few inches from the historic columns. We will also try to repair and paint the existing columns, and we will restore the existing gates. The gates at this time, the existing gates are not operational, some of them, so we will restore that. One of the improvement that will come out of this project is our engineering department will change the ADA, upgrade the ADA access. So we will have this here and this area and this one. So what we'll be doing is after restoring these gates, we will open them, and these will be the main pedestrian access for accessible access.
Through the original gates.
The original gates, the
Okay,
side
so
gates.
You'll walk right through
Yeah.
the entranceway.
Correct. You will walk, you could,
The center gates would stay closed, and the two pedestrian gates on either side.
yeah, they will be open for
Oh, okay.
ADA accessibility, so that will be available.
Okay.
And generally, as I stated, the gates will be open in the morning when the park's open, and then they will be closed when the park is closed at 10 p.m.
Does that mean that when the park is closed now, that the park literally is fully enclosed? It's a closed system that's theoretically secured by gates or walls at all points?
Correct. At this point, from the mountainside, the wall will be there and the gates will be closed, and at 10 o'clock, correct, you would not be able to have a car go through.
Unless anyone has any other questions, I don't think we have any cards from the public, so if it's okay, we could close the public hearing on this and have a discussion, and then we're not voting, I understand, right?
No, you
Mr.
can
Platt?
state any concerns or
Just
thoughts that you have,
concerns.
and we'll take it
Take
down.
them under
and
advisement.
Parks,
Okay.
go back to Parks.
Okay. So,
I
thank
do
you
have
very
one.
much.
I do have
Oh,
one
you have a
question.
question?
Just
Okay.
the gates now. Basically, it's just a chain fence that they lock on there, and the other one's a swing gate at the western one.
Correct.
But the two gates that are to the side, the two pedestrian gates now, they don't lock, right? Because I was there last night at 10 o'clock, and they were still open. So
The pedestrian gates?
the pedestrian gates.
Yeah, I believe that
It,
the
I
law,
didn't-
I mean, the park is open right now. You can go through the streets.
right, but you can access it after 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah, because
And
there's
there's-
nothing to prevent you. There are no
Okay.
gates, right? There's
So
no
the gates that
trolley.
you're putting there, are they going to be locked? They will be locked just to prevent cars from going in,
They
basically?
will be locked. At this time, we are talking about the gates, all the gates being locked, including pedestrian
Including the
access.
pedestrian gates?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your presentation, and if anybody would like to start a discussion and make any comments for the record that would be conveyed onto the Parks Department, we'd be happy to hear from all of you.
I just think from a security perspective that this is something important that needs to be done. As far as design, I think the gates conform with the design of the original gates, and I think sometimes less is more, and the simplicity, form follows function, and I think we're just trying to provide security. So I'm fine with the proposal. I think it works.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with Commissioner Vartanian. Being there, what they have there now just doesn't work at all for me, and I didn't realize that it was as meager as it actually was. So anything that provides some sort of security for the Brand Castle, I'm all for, and form follows function, and I think this works. It's not the most ornate, but it definitely works for me.
Yeah, the only comment I have would be on the design. I think the current proposal is sympathetic to the original. However, it looks to me a little bit too simplified and therefore a little bit too much in contrast to the very ornate gates.
Yeah, I think if I can just throw something in, one thing that did come from the gates is that when you look at them up close, I don't know if you had a chance, there's a circle motif.
Yeah, I wanted to talk
set in
about the circle
square.
and the
Okay.
oval, actually.
Okay.
So, for instance, you have a circle at every indication, where the gate kind of changes sections on the existing. On the new proposed, you really have it only on the very two ends, and it's almost, in my opinion, too few to bring that kind of commonality and design feature of the original. I'd like to see that really at a more repetitive pattern like the original ones, as well as the oval, which is above the circle at the bottom, brought back at key, maybe key transitions, meaning both ends of the gate. Just to a little bit more uniformly bring that design element in. It's very simple, and I think it wouldn't take away, but I think it would make the design a little stronger. I think the two circles that are added per section is too few to really accomplish the intent, I think. That would be my only recommendation. Other than that, I think it's done very well, and it meets the functional requirements, which obviously are most critical.
And if you want to reopen, the architect could discuss the idea.
That would be great, because my question, based on Commissioner Shire's comment, was going to be if we could see some close-ups of some of these details.
We do. We have those.
Okay, I was Yeah, I guess I wasn't sure what I was looking at exactly when I looked at those, so, but go ahead.
Chair Vidor, members of the commission, we actually started with more circles on the gate. There is somehow when you're working with historic preservation and working with historic elements, there is a line between are you going too far on one side or the other. So there was a concern that we're going too far in mimicking the existing gates. But we'll be glad to add more of the elements because they will decorate the new gates. We're just walking fine line, and we were concerned a little bit about doing that. So absolutely, we can add. And it's up to you. I felt that the oval element was really historic to the era. At this time, you don't see that much that element in the ironwork. So it's up to you. If you want us to add the oval also, we could do that too.
My comment is I agree with Commissioner Shire and feel that this reminds me a little bit of what I sometimes see on period revival houses that have installed new wrought iron gates. It's perfectly fine, as everybody said, but it has a little bit of a industrial feel to it that doesn't quite get as far as it needs to get. I'm completely sympathetic to the idea of overstating the wrought iron and curly cues and things, but this is in 1903 or 06. Can't remember the date that the thing was built, but it's a rather ornate building to begin with, and has all kinds of elements going at the same time, and I agree that it needs to be stepped up a little bit to bring it more into the era and style of the building and the architectural features of the central fencing.
Do you feel we add more of the elements beside the circle and the oval? Or do you feel that should do it, just adding, again, because we don't want to cross that line?
I think personally that would accomplish it. Like I say, I understand not wanting to take away from the beautiful ornate detail on the main entry and the historic gates, but I think you could really tie in the very simple repetitive pattern of the circle and oval on the top and bottom of the gates to the left and right.
Sure.
And it would still be fairly subdued, yet tie those a little closer together.
Yeah, each leaf of the gate lends itself to at least one additional circle, top and bottom, in the center.
Yeah.
Then you'd have, I think, 5 or 6 running across each section.
Yes, and in fact, we have them. I just, again, had the concern that we're going too far into mimicking the existing gates. So we certainly can add them.
Okay, I think that's it then. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good job. Okay. Thank you all. The next item is 7B, which is review of the North Glendale Community Plan in a historic context, looking at the documents in preparation of final staff submission to the Planning Commission and City Council. So do you want to advise us on how we're going to proceed? Is there a staff report on the general plan now? Or?
Yeah, well, you have your staff report in front of you.
Right.
And what we wanted to do, this is a big project, the community plan, and then the historic context is just one small part of that plan, but it's the one that you, as the HPC, you're going to be the body in the city that's reviewing this document that's really going to focus on that. Every city agency that's involved with any of the aspects of work in North Glendale will be looking at the community plan as we move forward. So it's going to transportation and parking tonight. It's already gone to Design Review Board. It's going to go to them again. Planning Commission will be hearing it, and ultimately the Planning Commission is the ultimate authority for the entire document, and then it goes to City Planning after their final review. So this is going to be a period that takes several months that Laura will talk about, but just in terms of your review today, we want to have Laura Stotler, our principal planner, who's largely been the leader of the effort along with Alan Loomis to put this community plan together, to just discuss the community plan. Then I will discuss the historic context, and then we also have an amendment that we need to make to the general plan to the historic preservation element to kind of tie this all together. You have one motion that we're hoping to hear from you, that you hopefully see this as a good thing, and can make a motion tonight that we'll then take to the Planning Commission to let them know that you have seen this. In terms of your review, we're going to be taking all of your comments relating to the community plan, and we're going to aggregate those with the comments of all of the other boards and commissions that look at this, and we'll present them as a group to the Planning Commission. In terms of the historic context, we're going to take your comments very directly, and we're going to amend and correct and add as needed to the community plan, hopefully with enough time to get this to the Planning Commission on August 17th. So we're asking, if you haven't had time to review this as thoroughly as you wanted to for today's hearing, we'll still be taking your comments individually that you could direct to me through the first week of August. We would love to hear as much as you have to offer today. If you have typo corrections, I know there are going to be all sorts of things that will need correcting. We may not need to discuss those, but things of substance or the direction of the document we'd love to hear today. So if you don't have any questions about the general structure, we'll wait for the discussion, I think, until after we've both made our presentations, and then we'll ultimately ask you to vote once you've had all your questions answered, hopefully.
Okay.
So here's Laura.
Good.
Use the arrows for some reason.
That's not working.
Yeah.
There you go. Chairman Bador, members of the Commission. The North Glendale Community Plan involves the area in the north portions of the city. It's basically Montecito Park, Spar Heights area north. As part of our community plan, we went out and we met with the community. We started back in spring 2009. We met with a variety of individual stakeholders, community groups, homeowners associations, went to businesses, chambers. From that input, we identified issues that were of concern to the community, and we presented those to the council. Council in June 2009 directed us to go have an advisory committee to talk about the areas where we had disagreement. And we met with the advisory committee numerous times. In April of 2010, we presented the results of the advisory committee discussions to the community. And then, based on those recommendations, we prepared a draft community plan. The preliminary draft was out for review this January and through May. And again, we also met with the advisory committee during that time to review the draft. And what we have before you today is the June 29th, 2011 version of the community plan, which we presented to the community on that date. The plan's organized in 5 topics, chapter areas. First one's an introduction. The second one is community vision. Then we talk about principles, and these are citywide principles. And we relate those to the individual places within the community. Think of Chapter 4 as really being the heart of it. That's where we talk about neighborhoods. And then we have Chapter 5, and that's the framework. How does this document fit into other documents and policy direction that we have in the city, also for the region and the state? So Chapter 2 starts with a community vision. This came directly from the advisory committee, and we feel this is really important because this is what the community said they wanted for their area. And I would point out that the history and preserving and enhancing neighborhood character were at most of importance to that group. And based on that input that we received from the public, Chapter 3 includes overall principles that would be citywide, and it's broken into various chapters. I'm going to focus in on 3.12. This is our history chapter. Provides policies that would relate citywide, and then also breaks them down as to how do the citywide policies directly impact North Glendale, and you'll see a paragraph on that. And right next to it, you'll also see a map, and the map that's included shows the development history of the community in North Glendale. It's broken down into the eras in which the properties were subdivided and built, and then also some of the historic buildings in the area have been identified on the map as well. Chapter 4 places, again, this is where the neighborhoods are identified, and you'll see policies, a vision for the future, how we're going to implement them, and some preliminary architectural design guidelines for each of the neighborhoods. We've identified several different areas based on common characteristics for those neighborhoods. And then within each one of those neighborhoods are several different types of uses that are identified. Again, this is a map that shows the neighborhoods we've identified in North Glendale. In Chapter 5, this is our policy framework. Think of this as a legal part that we have to have. And as part of this, it's interesting, we've also included an outreach outline of all of our community outreach that we've done. And you might find that interesting because we have done a lot of discussions with the community, and we wanted to make sure those were captured in the document. So for next steps, we started off with informational meetings to the Planning Commission and Joint Design Review Boards, and now we're seeking your recommendation as well as recommendations of other boards, as Jay has stated. And again, tonight we'll talk to the Transportation and Parking Commission. We have a joint DRB meeting scheduled, and then all those comments will be brought to the Planning Commission starting August 17th. And we're envisioning that we'll have some direction from Planning Commission to make modifications to the plan. We plan to make those modifications in September and then proceed to the City Council in October. And one of the issues we wanted to point out is that, Jay is going to elaborate on this, is the historic context. We're intending to include that as an appendix to our community plan. And we also provided a draft general plan amendment, a little overview of the general plan amendment. We don't have essentially a placeholder in our historic preservation element right now for community plans. So that's the majority of what the amendment is to allow us to have a community plan and to acknowledge its existence. I'd like to turn the remainder of the presentation over to Jay.
Thank you.
Okay, the historic context is a document that the Commission hasn't seen this type of document before. This is the first time in Glendale that we're having a context that kind of follows the Secretary of the Interior standards and the goals that the State Office of Historic Preservation gives us for historic contexts. That said, it is very similar to the preservation element, and it reads in some ways like the existing citywide preservation element. The idea is that after we develop community plans for the entire city, and we're not sure if that's going to be 5 plans or 6 plans, but somewhere in that number, we're going to have historic context for each of those sections of the city. Once we're done with that process, we're going to aggregate them, edit them, make it work so it flows in some sort of natural way, and that will then be a new preservation element that identifies not just the history of the area and tells us about its development, but also discusses what we know about the area, what's been designated or identified in surveys, the themes that we can kind of suss out from the historic development that we then use as a basis for future designations, either at the Glendale Register level or at the Historic District level or at the California or National Register levels. So the goal of a historic context ultimately is to kind of provide a framework that helps us with future designations by helping us have information up front that says, okay, this is significant because it identifies with a certain theme. And it reflects that theme in what way? Oh, in these ways that we've identified in the context. And then we also can look at issues like integrity, which at this point our ordinance doesn't address integrity, but most good ordinances do that. And we'll talk about that even later today, about some changes we might be able to make to bring that in. And that's the idea. Integrity is the issue of whether the building that we see on the ground today has enough material to kind of tell its story, to kind of reflect the important parts of its past. So just with that as an introduction, I wanted to first talk about how we put this together. We did this in-house. We basically pulled information from existing sources. To the best of my ability, I checked and verified some of those sources, but I know that not everything in them is accurate. So this will be a living document. We hope to get as many corrections made as soon as possible so that this then can go to the Planning Commission with your seal of approval. But in the future, as we learn more about North Glendale, as we hear about things that we've never heard about, we might identify other themes or other specific features that we would want to include in this. Because it's a general plan level document, we can't just go in and change it. We'll have to change it with City Council's approval. And we can only do that a certain number of times a year. So in general, we would compile all changes, not just to the historic context, but to anything in the community plan, and then take those to council kind of once we've got a group of things. But I think for now, we just have to make sure that what we have today and with your comments is something that we're going to be able to work with and that's usable. a lot of credit goes to two of the key sources of information are June Doherty's La Crescenta book and Mike Lawler and Robert Newcomb's La Crescenta book that really compiled a lot of what we know about the area. Another thing that you should know is that this very black and white looking document will have illustrations. So we will be dropping photographs in, maps in, and we'll be having better quality maps than what are in this version that you're looking at today, but basically conveying the same information. So if you have any comments about stories or anything that you think particularly would benefit from having some sort of illustration, please let us know also. There are 4 basic sections to the context, and this follows the basic format established by the state and the National Park Service. The beginning is kind of an introductory history to the area. And what's really important about a context, since it's a framework and a guide for how we're going to look at what's on the ground today and what we may designate and what we might not designate based on how it relates to the context, we're not telling a comprehensive story of North Glendale. There are things here that you may know, there's an interesting story, but if it doesn't directly relate to something about how the area developed or what we see today, it becomes less important. I wasn't 100% rigorous about that when I put this in, especially with some of the people who were involved, but I think I was very conscious of trying to make sure that every person we discussed and every event that we discuss in here relates to things that we see today or potentially will see, because we haven't surveyed the area, so we don't know what we're going to find. There may be remnants of the earliest days of agricultural development in the Crescenta Valley that are sitting in someone's backyard right now, and we just don't know it's there. So this document needs to be broad enough to kind of guess at what we might find or hear about in the future. So in terms of the history, I broke it down into several categories. The land, one of the things that was most impressive when we did our community outreach was there's a different feeling in the Crescenta Valley and in North Glendale about residents' attachment to the land and particularly to the mountains and the vistas that they have up there. So the land just became so important that we definitely want to include that in here and talk about, well, it's been important to people for generations, hundreds of years, obviously. Then we focus on the people who have lived in or spent time in the area, starting with Native Americans. We don't have any archaeological record of any permanent Indian or Native American sites in the area, but it was clearly used as a pass-through area and probably for grazing and hunting and gathering. We talk about the mission and the rancho periods, the Spanish ownership, the Mexican ownership, and then the American U.S. ownership. And then we talk about some of the early settlers who came in, the Anglo settlers who really set the stage for what we have today. So we give a little more focus to some of those people who did things such as, finding regular sources of water, laying out the plot grids that are still with us today, and the street pattern that we have in North Glendale. And then we looked at some other people of interest whose stories we didn't want to lose because there are actually things on the ground today, like Rockhaven or the Ananda Ashrama, that are really key and interesting aspects of the heritage that could have gotten lost if we didn't find a special section for them. So we kind of added those stories. And then we focused on events, and events was also something that was difficult. We had to do some filtering to make sure that we're talking about events that actually shaped the land today and shaped the experience of the residents of North Glendale today. We narrowed that down to the flood of 1934, to the construction of the 210 freeway, and then also to the citywide downzoning that occurred in the 80s and 90s that really brought down the allowable densities citywide, but then we talk about how that affects the North Glendale area. The meat of the history section comes where we look at the neighborhoods, and we want to talk about, well, why did this area become one of the key suburbs of the region? How did that happen? It was desolate, it didn't have a lot of water, it had a lot of things going against it, but there was something about North Glendale and the Crescenta Valley that made people want to be there, and there were different phases of that development. So we kind of break that down. We look at it as kind of early real estate speculation with people just saying, I'm going to buy this land and I'm going to divide it up, and I hope and pray that someone comes up here and buys lots and starts developing it. Obviously, that is what happened. And then there's the other story that's kind of a parallel story of how it became part of Glendale. For many, many decades, this was not part of Glendale, and so it developed under the jurisdiction of the county and with probably less regulatory oversight than had it been part of Glendale at the time. So those stories, it's kind of hard to juggle Crescenta Valley versus North Glendale because the stories are completely intertwined. But at all points, we're always coming back to a focus on what's in North Glendale, even when we're looking at Crescenta Valley history. So we lay out the various annexations that brought North Glendale into Glendale, and then we break development into pre-annexation and post-annexation. This is kind of an artificial divide. It seems to have some use, and we may learn more in the future in terms of what did the county expect from development, what laws and land use controls were there at the time, things that we don't know enough about right now. But we felt it was important to identify the parts of North Glendale that started their development earlier. So where we have areas like Highway Highlands and Verdugo City and Spar Heights. Spar Heights is kind of a different case, but these early developments that started in the 1920s primarily. And then we have areas like Spar Heights that kind of developed around the time of annexation, where parts of Spar Heights were being developed when half of it was in Glendale and half of it was outside of Glendale. Very quickly, it all became part of Glendale. So it's really interesting when you look at the maps and you look at the development history up there, how this all ties in to what we still see on the ground, and why Highway Highlands is a very different looking neighborhood than neighborhoods just a few blocks away in Crescenta Highlands. And for each of the neighborhoods that we've identified as part of the community plan effort, I did as much research pulling, again, existing information. I found some new things going through old editions of the LA Times and tried to put together as much as we have about each neighborhood so that we have a little historical background, which also is still reflected in most of these areas by what we see on the ground today and could help inform our decisions as the Commission and other city agencies are thinking about what's going to happen in North Glendale. One of the things that I think we should mention about the community plan is when we look at residential neighborhoods, which is the bulk of North Glendale, it really is a suburban bedroom community of Glendale in the greater LA area. None of the residential neighborhoods are envisioned for significant change. They're identified as areas of stability. So there's kind of an inherent kind of preservation character, neighborhood character mindedness that's built into the community plan. And then we have a few commercial areas that are looked at as areas to enhance, like Spar Heights, where we don't see large changes to the business district in Spar Heights, but we do see landscape improvements and other enhancements to the neighborhood that will make it kind of a more pleasant place for business and for people doing business there. But we don't see major changes in the building stock. And then we've identified areas like Foothill Boulevard and the area around Indian Springs, Verdugo Hills Hospital, where we do see room for some additional development. And that's all built into the community plan. And then that's something that will factor into, where we look for resources based on the historic context. And when I get to the goals, one of those goals specifically addresses those areas where there may be additional development. Section 2 identifies what we know is on the ground today in terms of historic resources. And North Glendale is not very rich in identified Glendale Register resources. We have 4 designated properties: the Le Mesnage Barn, the Walters House in Spar Heights, the Bonetto House in Crescenta Highland, in Verdugo City, and the Daly House in Whiting Woods. We know there's more up there. We know we have a historical society in the Crescenta Valley that is very keen on, helping residents there learn more about their area and identify potential resources. Once that starts happening, if we get more people interested in this document is, again, going to be the guide that we use to determine what's significant. We did do a survey of the stone houses that are really one of the key indigenous things that people in the area really love. It's the stones that rolled off the San Gabriels. People were building homes and building retaining walls out of these rocks. And we recently did an update of the survey, so that information is included in here. One thing that I already know that I neglected to put in here, so you can tell me to do it, but we'll do it anyways, is to add some of the resources identified in the Craftsman survey were in North Glendale, which I completely forgot about. So we'll have to add that and make sure that's in there. And then the rest of this section is to some degree boilerplate that talks about the National Register of Historic Places, the California Register of Historic Resources, and the Glendale Register, as well as the Historic District Ordinance that establishes the criteria that we need to follow if we're going to be designating properties in the future, and also identifies the integrity levels that the Park Service uses that we're hoping to incorporate more into our thinking about what is or is not a eligible resource in Glendale. Section 3 starts on page 35, and this is where we identify the themes and the property types associated with those themes. If this were a full-blown historic context where we had hired a professional at great expense, this section would be hundreds of pages, potentially. You can really go to town doing research on themes. What our goal was to identify the primary themes that we know right now are associated with the development of North Glendale and what we see on the ground today, and then identify the property types that we expect would likely be seen as part of those themes. So you can see that for the two of the suburbanization themes, there's a good deal of content in here. And that's because we used the suburbanization theme that one of our consultants had prepared for us in the research they're doing for the Ross Moines Historic District. And that's how these things work. You build upon other aspects of research. So we can expect that the suburbanization theme is going to be used in other contexts for Glendale. And at that point, we may expand on it, and then we would take whatever new we learned there and we could update our other contexts. So these are going to be, like I said, living documents that are going to grow and get better over time. But what I'd really be interested in to hear from the Commission is whether you think these themes are adequate to cover what you think is, that we know is important in North Glendale, and if you can help us, either fine-tune or focus them. And I'll just walk you through the format where for each theme that's identified, there's a discussion of that theme. Specific resources that we know to be associated with that theme will be discussed here. At that point, it doesn't mean that it's significant. It doesn't mean that it should be on the Glendale Register. It's just something that we know about that's on the ground that reflects the theme. Someone would have to come in, obviously, and nominate a property before we're even going to consider whether it's eligible or not. We then kind of identify first the property types that are associated with the theme. So, for example, the early residential and agricultural development, that's kind of a placeholder theme for things that may be up there that we don't know about. I know of one house from the 1880s that's really been altered, but it definitely must have some interesting heritage or story from those early farming days, but we know nothing about it. So we have to start guessing, like, what kinds of properties might be associated with that period. So I put in a single-family residence, likely a farmhouse, and then possibly outbuildings associated with agricultural uses. Barns, cisterns, animal pens, the list could go on. We just don't know what we're going to find. For some of the other themes where we really do know, in suburbanization, we're going to find single-family homes. We'll find some multifamily residences, especially in the post-war period. So these significance thresholds and property types are going to shift from theme to theme depending on what we expect that we're going to be able to find up there. And then when we find things that go against what we expected and we learn something new, they'll be modified in the future. So we have themes for residential, commercial development, transportation, water, healthcare, education, and civic, social, and religious groups. I linked as one section, although those could be broken down if we had a lot of information about any one category, but they tend to fall into similar categories. And then finally, parks and recreation is the theme. The final section is where we identify goals for North Glendale. And this is also where we would really appreciate hearing from the Commission to think, are there goals that we missed or ways to interpret these goals that we haven't thought of? A lot of it has to do with increasing public awareness that we have preservation programs, and through educational outreach, both through the city and through nonprofit groups and other sources, making sure people understand that their heritage is something that's on the ground today. It's important to a lot of people, not necessarily to everyone, but we did learn from the community meetings. History was one of the few things that we kind of threw off the table right at the beginning. Everyone agreed it was important. Everyone said, yes, this is something we need to look at and consider, but because there was no disagreement, we didn't need to discuss it very much. We focused our time on the things where we didn't necessarily agree or people didn't necessarily agree in North Glendale. So the goals that we've identified are raising public awareness through educational outreach about preserving resources, encouraging property owners to nominate sites of interest to the community to any level, whether it's local, state, or national. We want to let people know that there are incentives to encourage them to consider preservation, even if it wasn't the first thing on their list. We want to assist people in identifying potential resources and districts, and this is where staff will do outreach and have community meetings or meet with individuals, go on tours, help people kind of identify places that might be important. We would definitely like to see a historic resource survey conducted for North Glendale. That's identified already in the preservation element. It's something that we've had on the books for a long time. We've talked about it as a commission, and we know now in this economic world we're not going to be seeing a citywide or not even necessarily a community plan-wide historic resource survey any time, but we definitely want it to be identified as a goal because this document is going to last for decades. And, what's true today isn't true in 10 years necessarily. And then finally, we want to conduct a survey of these areas to enhance, and we'd look at that as a more short-term survey that could be a combination of staff and community involvement, specifically looking at Foothill Boulevard and the other areas that have been identified for enhancement or even for growth, so that we can make sure that any resources in those areas are identified to be considered as part of that process. Something like that, as you know, surveys don't necessarily save buildings, they identify buildings and they help us with our judgments in the future. So that is how we have it. I apologize, the footnotes are a mess. Word did something to the numbering and I don't know what happened. As best I remember, they're all accurate and they refer to the numbers that are in the document. There are a few sections I need to go back and footnote a little more carefully, but that was one of the big things that I just could not figure out how that happened. So the other aspect of what you're considering today, we have community plan, we have the historic context, and then we are also going to amend the general plan to revise the historic preservation element. And Laura already mentioned that we're going to be doing that to address the fact that community plans exist. We're not identifying this as the North Glendale community plan because we don't want to have to go back and revise or do a general plan amendment each time a new community plan comes on board. But we did realize that since we're doing this, we had the opportunity to bring the preservation element up to date because it was written before we had a historic district ordinance and also before we had the demolition review ordinance in place. So we're taking the chance to include those as well as the community plans. So that part of this discussion is relatively straightforward, but we need you to include it in your motion if you're going to be voting today so that we have your blessing on that. So with all of that, Laura and I and everyone else are open for questions and comments.
Would someone like to start with any, so now we are taking questions, and why don't we do questions like clarifications on things, because I think you want to also hear comments specifically on the community plan draft itself and on the historic context statement?
Yes, I think, well, let's break everything down into those components.
Okay.
I think questions first is a good idea.
Yeah.
And then comments, like I said, for small technical issues, if you could submit those so we don't need to discuss those in this setting. Mm-hmm. But if you have substantive kind of comments or things that we need to add or anything else, I think this would be the time to go through those.
Okay. So without getting into specific comments on how these documents would be revised, does anyone have questions for either of the two speakers, presenters, on what they presented? Anything need to be clarified? Or why don't we?
Well, I'll just start with a general comment. Just thanks and accolades to you. This is a huge effort and really well done. All the documentation was very thorough, and for you to have to do it all in-house and not have an outside consultant is pretty amazing. So I commend you all. Do we want to start with questions per document and take a document at a time, or just?
Well, I think that depends on what they want to do.
I think that would be
what
easier.
Would be easier?
Yeah.
Easier for me.
So you want to do, we're going to look at the Glendale Community Plan
Let's start
first.
there.
And we'll all weigh in on that, and then we'll go into the historic context statement. So unless anybody has anything to add, why don't we just start with comments changes, suggestions on the community plan itself. So who would like to start that process? All right, Ms. Vartanian. I'll give it to you.
Well, I would also like to echo Commissioner Shara's sentiments. I think this is a huge amount of information that has been pulled together and really presented in a very concise and understandable manner. I have to admit, it was a lot to try to digest in the span of a week. And so, and one of the things that I was struggling with initially was sort of fitting in, looking at the general plan, the elements, and then where the community plan, fits into that. I think through reading the document, one of the things I really do appreciate is at the end of each section or within each section where you talk about linking, how linking citywide principles to each of the various sections. But in terms of specific suggestions or comments, I think I'd probably defer at the moment, to starting a discussion. I don't have anything specific at the moment.
On the general plan.
Right, on the North Glendale Community Plan. But I do think it's very well organized, and I learned things about some of these neighborhoods that I didn't know. In fact, I didn't know that we have a neighborhood built around a seismic fault.
That's right.
I found that very interesting.
You won't be moving anytime soon?
No, not up there. But again, I think the vision that was set out by the community. I think this has been put together over the course of a couple of years, and I think, as you noted, the vision of the community is very clear. I think there's obviously a great interest in the history of the area, and people are very connected. And I did find each of the sections about I think it's 7 different districts that it's broken out into, to be very well delineated in terms of the vision, implementing the vision, design guidelines, goals, etc. So I think with that, I'll just pass the baton at the moment.
Okay. Commissioner Morgan, do you want to comment on the general, I keep calling it the general plan, the community plan document?
Well, like Commissioner Vartanian, I found I'm a little bit more intimate with it than she is, because I've been looking over it for a long time. I don't really have something per se to say against it right at the moment. I need to. I would like to defer for just a moment. I've got some thoughts, but I've got to think about it for a second. So if I could go on to.
We'll get back to you.
Okay, just a couple of things. Unless I missed it, one thing that I thought might be helpful as you talk about the vision of each area, I thought in your summary paragraph, it might be helpful to have the context of the period in time that, or decade of development. I kept finding myself referring back and forth to the development by color document where it talks about kind of what year. So if I had, while I was reading it, this was between 20s and 30s, or this was 50s to 70s, that might be a piece of information that might be more helpful to relate this tiny, tiny colored document with kind of a general overview. I think in one of them I saw that, but in the others I didn't.
Yeah. Stephanie Reich will address that.
Good afternoon. Yeah, we did struggle with where to put that information, and because we believe it's important that these neighborhoods, while the focus is that they'll remain stable, we don't want to freeze them in time or have a sense that there's sort of a historic period of development that architects or owners or applicants need to refer to. And so we thought that the best place for that to reside was within the historic context.
You mean of the map?
The dates of development.
Oh, you're saying within the second document?
No, within the chapter, the neighborhood, chapter 4,
Oh, okay.
where we break down each neighborhood.
Okay.
We removed that information from the Chapter 4 and specifically put it into the historic
Oh, I
context
see.
document.
That's why it was
So
missing.
we did struggle with that because it is important to understanding each area, but we don't want to give the sense that that this area is, say, frozen in a particular time.
And there are specific things we've identified, like in Crescenta Highlands, Highway Highlands, and Verdugo City, where there's a fair amount of use of stone. We see that as an important character feature of the neighborhoods, regardless of which decade that went in. So that there's mention of that in 2 of those. We've already done a rough edit of this and identified places where we could beef up reference to kind of either specific aspects of historic preservation or just reminders that this is also part of the plan. And so, for example, in one of those neighborhoods, we forgot to mention the stone. It just didn't make it in the cut. So we're going to add something like that.
Okay. Then my next comment would be overall, I think it would be helpful to take a pass just on punctuation alone. And I know you mentioned that you need to do that. But when it comes to numbering or bullets or outlines, it's not consistent whether there's a period at the end of each one, nothing at the end, a comma. So if you want to take a pass through the whole document once just with those eyes, I think you'll catch a lot of those. On page 61 and 91, the same photograph is presented, one under Foothill Main Street and one under Spar Heights. And I don't know if the photos are specific to the area that you're discussing, but I was a little confused by that one. Do you see that?
Yeah, I see it. Were these generic photos? Just to,
Oh, just generic.
I think
Okay.
we did that in several locations to
Okay,
illustrate
just checking.
the vision. Yeah.
If I may on that, one of the consistent comments we've been hearing from other commissions and from members of the advisory committee as they're reviewing the document is that some captions on the photos would be very useful, so we'll be addressing that in a future update.
And then as I was reading through section 5, it was really more of a question. I wasn't sure how the relationship was between 5.3.4, where it references the greener Glendale plan, and 5.5.3. So on page 117 and 119. Seemed a little redundant, but I'm not sure if they were meant to or necessary to discuss the greener plan
This is
in both locations.
assembly bills versus city documents.
The assembly bills are essentially state law, and then the Greener Glendale is how we're actually drafting a plan for the city. It actually goes a little bit beyond, the Greener Glendale plan goes beyond SB 375 because it's actually a sustainability. It kind of combines aspect of SB 375 along with AB 32, which is the greenhouse gas bill. So I put them in separate parts because one of them's a city plan and the other ones are state.
Got it.
But the city plan addresses
Both.
aspects
Yeah.
of the state.
Okay.
If I may interject on this point too, in Chapter 5, part of our notation is that we don't discuss the historic context that J. Road prepared. That's not mentioned in here or referenced at all anywhere in the document, so it's clearly something we'll have to be adding in Chapter 5 in the introduction and probably a few other locations throughout the document.
Okay, good. Yeah, because I was confused as how the documents relate. So that'll be perfect. Those are my general comments.
Yeah, just
very good job.
to address that basic relation, the historic context is going to be an appendix to the community plan, so it will be, tied to the community plan, approved at the same time, and once approved, it's part of the community plan. So that gives us a fairly strong assurance that, they can't be separated after that. So.
Great.
But we do, like Alan said, need to make more reference to it in the text here, and hopefully we'll get some comments or ideas on that also. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Commissioner Morgan, did you want to comment now, or did you want me to go ahead?
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. All right. I do have some comments on specific sections
Great.
of the document. But first, I also want to say that this is a wonderful document. It was a little bit overwhelming to digest it all. I've never read a community plan before. This is my first one, and specific to this community. And I think it's wonderful. It was fascinating to read, and I think it's going to get a lot of use by just the general public and local historians and people who are interested in the community at large. So it's wonderful, and kudos to all of you and to the people on the advisory who obviously worked very hard on it. So thank you very much. My general impression when I read it, just trying to get my whole brain around the thing, was that I wanted to see, and you'll please correct me if it doesn't belong here, but that there needed to be more mention in different sections of things related to our, how we handle aspects of historic preservation. And the first one that I have is on page 2, under the section, What is a Community Plan? And on the topic of numbering, I don't know if it's possible to eliminate bullets. I think bullets sometimes are you just don't have a number to refer to. Like a section, you have to say the 5th bullet point, or people have to count to see what they're looking at. It would be great if you could just have numbers or letters for each separate element rather than using bullet points.
But just to defend bullets, one thing numbers does is it establishes more of a
hierarchy.
A perceived hierarchy.
Yes, it's a perceived
Bullets are a
hierarchy,
little
which
looser than that.
isn't good, but okay, I made my comment, and whatever is best, you will do. But on the 5th and final bullet point, you do mention providing a basis for establishing historic districts. And I was wondering if you could add establishing surveyable areas, historic landmarks, that type of thing in that particular section there.
Yeah, we could add Glendale Register as well
Glendale
as
Register.
historic resource surveys.
Okay. And then, of course, as was mentioned previously, you will be directly referencing the historic context statement as an appendix here, so that it's all one document.
Yeah, we'll first have that on page 5, where we kind of how to use this community plan, where we outline the chapters.
Right.
So we'll mention it as an appendix.
Great.
And then we've already seen a few places throughout the document
Right.
where sporadic reference seems like it's needed. So.
Yes, okay, thank you. And then in Chapter 3, page 14, knowing that, the community is very interested in maintaining the rural, kind of nice, small-town atmosphere, I think in the growth, the section about managing growth, we need to acknowledge that we respect the historic resources that are present in neighborhoods, and that we also acknowledge the historic neighborhoods themselves, and put a little bit more language about historic context into this particular section. And I don't know where exactly that should go, but probably in one of a bullet point, maybe.
Yeah, it could go in the last paragraph on the page.
Or in one of the.
Seems like it might fit there.
Okay.
We can talk about, because like Stephanie said, we don't want people to see this document as something that's saying all of North Glendale is historic and important, but we do want to remind that when we do know there are resources, or we identify potential resources, the city has provisions already in place.
Right.
Nothing will change through this, but we want people to know that will be part of the review.
Right, and we know that growth and historic preservation sometimes have to be mentioned in the same paragraph, because we don't want one to
They're not
preclude
enemies.
the other. They're not enemies, right.
If I may interject here too, Chair Vidor. This is a section where my notes and corrections on the document, I think, is going to be the place where we need to elaborate the general policy for growth management, which is areas to maintain areas to enhance or areas to transform. It's implied in this section and in the map, but like actually discussing that as a policy and what that means really isn't discussed anywhere in the document. So that's probably where we're going to be elaborating that as a basic strategy.
Elaborating, no, but mentioning.
Yeah, so I think
percentage.
certainly areas to maintain, as it's conceived of in this plan, is areas that respect historic character and some of the other
Right.
issues you brought up.
That, one of the impacts of growth is to pay particular attention to these types of things. Okay. And then, let's see, something else here on page 20, that under 351 citywide principle, that when you're talking about the policy and the framework, again, along the same lines, that you could add another bullet point and talk about the types of preservation tools that you're going to use to approach historic preservation, that there are certain methodologies and ways in which we make sure that we exercise appropriate land use and that preservation tools that we have at our disposal in the city come into play there.
Yeah, that would be a good place to mention the demolition review ordinance, that we do identify historic sites.
Right. Okay. Let's see. A couple more things. On page 34, when we're looking at the history here, there's a short paragraph and that a bullet point, and then we talk about our commitment to preservation of historic buildings. And I think, did we mention historic districting there and preservation of neighborhoods?
Yeah, I think we weren't specific about any level of designation.
Yeah, we do.
So we don't mention the Glendale Register there.
No.
Or any of the other registers or historic districts. So we could put all of that
Okay.
right in that first section.
I think that would be a good idea.
And then I think at the bottom, the last sentence there also, we forgot
Yes,
to
to-
include historic districts when we talk about potential sites.
Yes.
So it would be
right.
potential sites and historic
Right.
districts.
Right. That we need to work not only to deal with what we've identified, but to work on getting toward identifying what we don't know anything about. And then on page 45, which talks about the Crescenta Highlands area, and you have actually a nice picture of a house with what looks like a stone wall here, and that area also is interesting from the perspective of stone buildings, and that it wouldn't be a bad idea.
Yeah, that's the one we forgot.
that.
It just escaped
Well.
our net.
Right. And then the only other things were looking at the Montrose Shopping Park. You do mention, early facades.
Where are you on that?
I'm just looking at the general vision statement. Oh, I'm sorry, page 87. Page 87. I had two comments there. There's a section, there's an intro section, and then there's a couple places where you talk about the characteristics of the Montrose Shopping Park, and on 87, we speak generally about the character-defining features, but maybe there should be a statement that mentions specifically what the character-defining features are of the neighborhood, and that the neighborhood's character, as evidenced by those features, should be maintained.
Yeah, and that, I don't think we're going to be able to, character-defining features are really identified through a more intensive survey.
Oh.
So that would be us. The one thing that isn't here, though, is that we talk about in the context, is the fact that there are old buildings buried under new buildings. And we've already had a couple of design review cases where we've acknowledged that, and we haven't said, oh, there's an old facade under here, we'd like to see you restore it. But we have said there's an old facade under there, we don't want you doing anything that could possibly damage what's there until we really know what's there.
So opportunities
be-
to restore historic facades then should be expanded to talk about, mitigating destruction of the historic facades. or something to that effect, right?
Okay.
You have one bullet point here that mentions historic facades, but, talking about the care that needs to be taken to preserve whatever is there.
Oh, yeah, where we, I don't need, that may be strongly worded where we say should be explored. We might.
Well, if I may on this one, one of the foundation efforts for the
Protect and
North
restore.
Glendale plan was a series of workshops that the planning staff did. This was in 2008 now, specifically related to the Montrose Shopping Park and an interest in daylighting the historic facades that are buried under newer buildings was a very strong desire expressed by the community at that time. And I think that does need to be reflected here. Because, in fact, we did relatively little outreach with the Montrose Shopping Park community in large measure because a year before we started this whole effort, we spent almost a year working with them and very focused and was
Right.
really
You
sort of
figured
the...
you'd covered everything with them, huh?
Yeah, and in the course of 2-3 years, certain things are sort of...
Right.
Our memory is getting a little hazy. So thank you for reminding us.
Okay. Well, that, we don't know what's going to happen, but if they're that excited about it that they'd want to daylight these things, then maybe, as Commissioner Shire just suggested, we could say to protect and...
And that's where, in our goals section, if we can do more outreach and let business owners know that there's tax incentives and possibly other incentives if they did want to restore, that could bring them up to the level of federal tax credits, not just Mills Act for the Glendale Register. So we should actually include information about federal tax credits, probably in Section 2 of the context.
Okay. Makes sense. I was looking for, and maybe I missed it, the statement, neighborhood character should be preserved, and wondering if it isn't in the vision statement for Montrose, if it should be. I may have not seen it, but that was a phrase that I really would have liked to have seen in the opening paragraph. Preservation of neighborhood character.
What would you mean by neighborhood character being preserved?
Well, that's the catch-22, because we're not defining neighborhood character, but that seems to be a very important thing that people talk about and love about the Montrose Shopping Park, that it has this hometown pedestrian storefronty feel to it, and that we shouldn't compromise that.
I guess where I'm kind of coming at this is I certainly understand if the description you're describing is very true in terms of the experience we had working with the Montrose community about what they wanted, how they wanted to see the shopping park evolve into the future, which was they wanted to see that hometown character essentially preserved. I'm a little reluctant to use the word preserve since that tends to carry, now we're saying it should be a designated district. So we'll find a way to sort of convey that sentiment without...
Conserved.
And I think we may have actually accomplished that already. Let me read this sentence to you that's in the vision statement at the top of page 87. It's the last sentence in that opening, or the last two sentences. This district will continue to promote and capitalize upon Montrose Shopping Park's history, pedestrian-friendly design, and quote-unquote hometown feel that provides unity throughout the shopping corridor, which I think is interesting because we do have buildings from many decades. We have buildings from 70s, 80s, facades from the 90s and beyond. So with all of that change, we still have a place that does have this kind of unique kind of feel to it.
And isn't this really the oldest small business district in what is now Glendale proper? I mean, it's...
Glendale, yes.
It would be, since the first building is 1914,
Yes.
so it predates Brand Boulevard.
So,
But
no, it has
Well,
a special place in history in Glendale.
Yeah, and if I recall, Jay, and maybe Commissioner
Actually, it
Morgan...
doesn't predate Brand Boulevard, I'm sorry.
No.
Commissioner Morgan may remember this too. I believe the business district
1905.
is one of the first in the nation, or if not at least the state,
It is the,
of its particular kind.
In terms of the shopping park?
yeah.
The Shopping Park Association
It's in 67.
business
Oh, the
district.
association, perhaps. The concept of the shopping park and the streetscape changes, that was in the zeitgeist of the period, and this was influenced by one in Colorado.
Right.
So it's not groundbreaking,
Okay.
but regionally and locally, it's definitely interesting, and it's the only example we have in Glendale.
So maybe it's something
But let me
like that.
just, the last sentence also, the hometown character is further encouraged with the retention of local merchants, community festivals, and a variety of shops, restaurants, and cafes. Both of those, I think, are getting at what you're thinking, or is there something else you'd like to see there?
Well, that generally does it. I guess I keep defaulting back to physical characteristics, like, relatively low, modest storefront type buildings, and,
we have-
a lot of pedestrian activity.
We have the area features a strong street edge flanked by 1- and 2-story commercial buildings that adjoin wide public sidewalks.
Yeah. There it is.
If I may, I think one of the other edits we should include and mention in the vision statement is that's 2 years ago, approximately, the City Council officially designated Montrose as Glendale's Old Town.
Right.
As a result of that effort, I believe it's the association now refers to themselves as Montrose Old Town.
So that should be mentioned.
That should
here.
be, that terminology should be used here.
And that was an act of City Council.
It was.
Okay. So that's going to go in. They're having a private conference. Excuse me. So you'll put Old Town, reference to the Old Town
Yeah.
designation in. Okay.
Tough for me, but And were there E's on the end of both those words? I can't remember.
Oh, God, I hope not.
Only on shopping.
Was there a ye anywhere involved in that?
Okay. Well, it's great, and it was also nice to see that other jurisdictions were consulted because, the Crescenta Valley is so, intermingled with different jurisdictions that, obviously great outreach was done. So that's about it for me. So now we'll hear from Commissioner Morgan if he has anything to add.
Well, I do, a little bit. Most of the stuff, when I tend to read this, I tend to look at all the hard work that they've done on it, and I think, I get lulled into not being critical enough on it. But I do have some things in the Spar Heights Business District, which is near the area I am. It's on page 89. It says the buildings will maintain their modest scale. Is there a definition of what modest means? Is that a single story? Because most of these buildings butt up to residential areas. Is it?
Well, I don't know that we have a definition of modest scale, but I think what we're looking at doing is...
Is that like single story or?
I think we're looking at 1 and 2 stories. I know we do have some larger buildings in there now. There's a credit union, which I believe is 45 feet tall. But that building actually does stand out. Everything south of Broadview tends to be, other than that building, tends to be smaller scale. So, and I would say, I'm talking about Ocean View when I'm thinking of the Spar Heights. I realize that we do have some larger buildings right at Broadview and Verdugo. There's a newer medical building, which we've heard about, which people aren't very happy with. But for the most part, we are looking at 1 and 2 story buildings. Even some of the newer things that have been built there, other than that medical office building, have been smaller. So I think we're looking at maintaining the smaller scale. That's what we heard from the residents. They didn't want to see big buildings. We've heard that even from the business association. They were looking at encouraging basically maintenance of existing buildings and existing businesses. They weren't looking at transformation of the entire area. One of the concerns we did have was with height. That area right now is Zone C3, and along Ocean View, basically south of Broadview for the majority of the area. On the west side, it's adjacent to single family. And so one of the suggestions that we have is it's not part of the community plan, but it's part of a zone change that's going along with the community plan, is to limit height in that area to 35 feet.
Okay.
And that's part of in keeping the area low scale. And that we see that as being essentially a buffer area between the other businesses that might have a larger height elsewhere in the Spar Heights area versus the ones that are directly adjacent to single family.
That would also be for the Montrose Shopping Park itself, also, keeping it within the framework that it is now.
Well, Montrose Shopping Park has a different zoning. So I'm thinking specifically in Spar Heights. So in this area 5,
Right.
we would be looking at having a 35-foot height limit. I don't recall offhand what the height limit is in the CR zone. I'd have to look
I
that up.
believe it's 40, 45,
Yeah.
somewhere in that range.
Okay.
Anything else?
No.
Okay. So, thank you all.
We were expecting more, Commissioner Morgan.
I know, there will be.
Yes.
And then, so following on that same question, Is the zoning regarding heights going to be different in each area so that as, as we transition or as we have new development, could you have an area with a very low profile next to an area that might have a much higher profile, or will it become more, what's the word I'm looking for?
Well, right.
Conforming in terms of heights. Like if you had an area that you have just 2-level buildings, but the area next to it is zoned for, skyscrapers. I exaggerate, but.
Actually, we're looking at essentially three zone changes right now that would affect height. One of them is along Ocean View. Again, that would actually be reducing from a 50-foot to a 35-foot. That's what the staff proposal is. We're also looking at portions of Verdugo, essentially between the shopping park and the freeway on the north side. We're looking at actually increasing the height on the south side. In portions, you can get up to 50 feet. And we're looking at increasing it on the north side, not changing the uses, but changing the height up to 45 feet. And again, that would be so the sides would match on both sides of the road. And then perhaps the most contentious height proposal that we have going right now is on Foothill. We're looking at doing a commercial hillside zone. It would be a new zone on Foothill. Right now, Foothill is zone C3 within Glendale, and that has a 50-foot height limit. We have 3 proposals, and these came, 2 of them came from the advisory committee, 1 from staff. We had no agreement on the advisory committee on heights for what ultimate height on Foothill should be. So we have one group that favors 35 feet, and so that's one of the recommendations that we'll be bringing to council. Another group recommends maintaining the height as it is and just changing perhaps some of the setbacks. That's a 50-foot limit. That's another proposal, and then staff has a third proposal, which basically allows a combination of the two. The majority would be 35 feet. However, for some of the larger properties and the deeper properties, it could go up to 50 feet for up to, I believe it's 30% of the front along Foothill. So we basically have 3 different height proposals that are under review right now. We did hear from the Foothill Chamber of Commerce. They took a vote and they like 42 feet. So now we've got, we have comment letters coming in right now. So we have, on those comment letters, we have a variety of heights being expressed. So what we'll be bringing to council, or planning commission rather, is we'll be bringing the 3 height proposals, and then all the other proposals that come in from comments, we'll let the commission know that we've received those.
I think in terms of your question, thinking about commercial development right next to a single-family residential neighborhood, whether it's historic or not, there is already built in, there's buffering between zones that's built in, and especially when we have topography issues in terms of retaining walls and setbacks and landscaping of those areas, that's something that's taken into consideration.
Yeah, I found it interesting also because I think I heard loud and clear that the residents appreciate their views of, the hillsides.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know this is outside of our purview, but thank you.
Are we ready to move on to the historic context?
Yes.
So we'll discuss our comments on that document. And who would like to start?
And if you could tell me for each commissioner, if you know that you also have things you'll be sending me separately, just let me know, and then I'll have an idea that I need to look for that within our time frame. So.
Okay. So somebody like to start off the comments on the historic context statement?
I have less comments on this and found it very educational and informative as to the entire history.
Cool.
That's your comment? Great, thank you.
Whoa.
I'm going to write that as the epigraph at the beginning.
Right.
Goes on my tombstone.
If I may, on this, just the overviews, I think, and between Jay and Laura's presentation, maybe it was glossed over, but the discussion of the neighborhoods as they are named out and the boundaries, that was actually verified with the advisory group. We had one meeting where we basically asked them, what do you call yourselves? What neighborhoods do you call you? Where's the edge of Spar Heights? And that actually involves slight shifting of some of the existing policy boundaries that we have as we define neighborhoods.
So you didn't use historic?
It was also based on, let me also say, it was also based on some of the historic information that we knew and gathered about the neighborhoods. So there is a pretty strong correlation between the community's sense of what their neighborhood is and the historic boundaries of those neighborhoods as they were originally developed. So, you know, Whiting Woods, Glenwood Oaks are pretty obvious examples because right now there's only one way into those neighborhoods. But that will, to a certain extent, change some of the discussion when we talk about homes that would be designated and talking. Part of the GIS presentation is always, you know, what neighborhood is this house in? Is it the best example in this neighborhood? This will become these neighborhood boundaries will become the new definition for that discussion. Mm-hmm. But it was based out of a lot of historic research on Jay and our interns' part, and a lot of discussion with the community. And even the issue of the names, too. So we know that Verdugo City is a name that some people don't agree with, but it has been in historic usage. Crescenta Highlands apparently seems to be a kind of compromise name between what everybody refers to as La Crescenta, but that's the county. Mm-hmm. But there was this old name, Highway Highlands, so we'll just mash them up, and that's kind of what people use. But it's not uniformly like agreed on as that's the indigenous name to that neighborhood.
But maybe it will be, and that's really nice because there is a lot of confusion about La Crescenta and whether it's Glendale or not, and of course it's both. So now we have a name for it, which is great.
Yeah, except for Crescenta Highlands, for the most part, these names reflect close to historic boundaries. Mm-hmm. But, for example, Montecito Park includes all of the original Montecito Park development, but then there were areas that were developed later, not under the same company or layout. We just can't break it up. What's interesting is when you look at the development map, the multicolored development map that's on page 18, we're going to make sure that whenever this goes out, when this goes out, that this is in a more legible format because it really helps you see, and you only have black and white copies, so it's not very useful at all right now. But when it's online, particularly, and you can zoom in, you learn a lot about these areas just by looking at the 5-year increment that it was developed in, and it's kind of fascinating.
Okay.
And it helps us identify boundaries. The boundary of Highway Highlands is very clear when you look at it in that developmental history.
That's great. Okay, does either Commissioner Vartanian or Commissioner Morgan want to go next?
Well, for me, it's very nicely written. There's just a lot of historic things that needed to be changed or updated, and I don't know whether it's worth going today or just sending you an email on lots of minutia.
Yeah, if it's minutia, I think this is a public forum, and we want people to know, what the commission knows and can share with everyone. If it's things that you think are in factual error and it's worth talking about here, I'd love to hear it. There's no sensitivity on the dais.
Okay.
So let us know what you think.
Well,
but you're right, minutia we may not need. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is minutia, but page 19, it's the paragraph, Holmes and Walton built their land office at what is now the northeast corner of Verdugo. It's February 22nd. It was Washington's birthday in 1913.
I cannot believe.
I know. So that's one day off. The car barn.
This document is...
Toss it away.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff that just needs to be tweaked. So
so let's put that in the minutia level. But,
okay.
But anything, especially, but we want this to really be accurate. So that stuff's important.
So Commissioner Morgan will mop up.
I will
send it in.
There's some things that need to be rewritten.
That kind of thing. Let us know where you're.
Well, I would encourage the historic resources in North Glendale.
Do you help with pages? Though?
Oh, yeah, that's page 28. I feel that there are a lot more historic resources in North Glendale, but the people up there they're not aware of the fact that there's a lot of historic resources.
The point of this document, we can't use the context to identify things that we think might be historic. My error in this was not including things from the Craftsman Survey, where we actually have factual information from a survey consultant. But, I agree with you. And if you notice, there are mention of historic properties made throughout the document that aren't designated, like Rockhaven or the Ashrama, that I think we can pretty safely say are historic sites of North Glendale. But in terms of a list, this section is really saying this is what has been designated, and this is the process for designating other things in the future.
Well, looking at the list, there could be eligibility determination. I think there are quite a few, and I hope the people that live at those properties will get a chance to look at this and actually nominate their house.
Eligibility, though, is an official word in preservation land, so we need
Right.
to, that comes from a qualified consultant who can make that assessment, not
Correct.
not the fact that we love it. So,
Thank you.
no.
I don't have anything substantive to add. Again, I think early on I said that it's obviously a tremendous amount of historic information pulled together in a very concise and readable manner. And I found it also very educational. And as a living document, as you mentioned before, I think it'll probably, expand as we move forward. But
Definitely.
thank everybody who worked on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a few specific comments. Strike me down if they're too minute, but I'll go for it. On the topic of photographs, I would love to see photographs of the key historic buildings and structures that the conventional wisdom is that they're important, like Rockhaven and Spar Heights Rec Center and the Dunsmore Park walls and all of that, and also any photographs of the key people associated with these things and with captions, so that we can kind of decorate the document with some of the things that we know are important, and then go on from there.
Yeah, we'll have a reformatted, illustrated version for you at your August meeting.
Okay.
So
Fantastic.
you'll have that for review, and then you can comment on that again.
Yes.
Just to make sure the final product is what you want.
And then thank you for mentioning the Craftsman Survey. I participated in that survey and actually was assigned the houses up in the north area, so I feel a special sense of ownership of those houses because I was up there.
I apologize, my brain froze on that. I didn't even think about it, and we'll
That's
definitely add
okay.
it. So.
There's something I noticed on one of the drawings called the two-strike that I wanted to ask about and just make sure I
Page is that on?
understood. That was the one with the circles.
What page
And I don't
number?
have all the pages with me, so I'm
On
leaning
page
over
page
on
3.
3.
Yeah, this
Yeah,
is
It's the areas circled.
Yeah, that's a remnant from a map we did where we were identifying park spaces, because you can see besides the neighborhoods, it's mostly
Okay,
parks.
so you meant
Two-strike
strike
is a
it-
park
strike
that's
it
in La
from the-
Crescenta, so we'll take that out.
Okay.
There's also an orphan arrow that looks like it's pointing to Dunsmore Park we'll take care of.
Okay.
But
And
we'll probably ultimately have a somewhat more clear map, because the goal of this map is to show North Glendale in the context of the Crescenta Valley.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll probably need to identify where Tahunga is, where the county boundary is. It's a little
really
hard to
good
see
idea.
here.
If I may, I think our ambitions with both the context statement and on the community plan is that all the maps will eventually sort of have a similar size and formatting and kind of notation. Right now, some of them are full page, some are half page. It's sort of all over the place. That's a measure of
right.
kind of cobbling together a lot of resources from different.
Okay. And then you're actually including those two surveys, Highway Highlands and the Craftsman Survey, as bibliography references, formal,
Yeah.
not just
So
mentioning
you mean
them,
the
but they're
Stonehouse survey?
Stonehouse Survey.
Yeah,
and
I can
they-
definitely
and that
do
they'll-
that.
They'll be bibliographied at the end, by document, name and number, whatever, however one identifies them. And then any other surveys, there was one in particular that I know was not completed, but it was interesting, and it had to do with mid-century apartment buildings, and this was several years ago. There was a historic context document being drafted about that, and I wondered if that particular document or any other documents that are floating around might relate to this historic context thing and should be mentioned or referenced. That one was the one that I remembered, but there may be even more. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think that was ever completed.
Right.
I
remember
I'd have to
that
look for it. I haven't seen it in a long time. But that would definitely fit into probably the post-war suburbanization,
Okay.
where we could have a section talking about for
Okay.
multifamily development.
Maybe just bring that back into
Assuming it's usable in
Yeah,
the state
right,
it's
it
in,
may
which I
be
can't say, but I'll look for it and put it in here.
If I may follow up on that, Jay, do we have in the context statement some discussion about apartment development other than the downzoning effort that happened? as an
Yeah,
example?
it's mentioned in this section, but barely. It's just identified as one of the property types that could
As a
be associated with the
property
theme.
theme.
But it's not really, I think, there's a small paragraph on page 42 about multifamily development, and I think I may have limited it further than it really is. I said it's found in portions of Verdugo City and then the Verdugo Hills, Indian Springs area. I think there may be a couple of other neighborhoods that have multifamily, so I'll double check on that. And then I'll look for the context that we did and see if we can fold some of that. Because like I said at the introduction to this, any document that the city has prepared, and also documents prepared by the National Park Service, they encourage us, we're free to pick and choose from that material, so we're not constantly starting research from ground zero. And so if I find stuff that we can put in here, I'll definitely do it.
Okay. And I assume, since you mentioned the Craftsman thing, that whatever was identified would be listed in this
The
format?
same kind of format,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. On page 26, you, I think quite correctly, mentioned some very notable mid-century modern masterpieces in the Whiting Woods area, specifically and these are not, except for the Daley House, these are not registered landmarks, but they're very significant, the Neutra House and the Lautner House. And then you mentioned in the Daley House, art glass designed by prominent local artist Robert Brown.
Oh, yes.
Whose house is next door to the
Right,
Daley
I have
House.
to help enhance the value of my Robert Brown collection.
That's right, yes, all of those who...
Okay. Perfect. Now, and what
would you
about
mention the house
the
next to-
Schaefer and the Taylor House? Anything
No, I
on
think that it's just good that they're mentioned.
happy that it's there. Okay,
Yes.
great.
I know you didn't want to get into undesignated things, but those are so important that it's a good idea. Right. And then in the historic context on page 36, the whole thing about how all these stone houses got built and why, that there's such an interesting, basically that the Crescenta Valley is like at the bottom of this long mountainous thing where rocks are falling, if you look at it from thousands of feet up, and that, how geologically or otherwise we came to be building from these, and is there enough explanation of, the natural, the nature-oriented basis for why we have all this alluvial stone incorporated into these houses and buildings? So kind of more of a historic context statement about the stones.
Just looking at it, I'm looking at page 37, and it seems
Maybe
in between. No, it's not there.
It isn't there.
I'm just. It looks like there's a spot where it would fit nicely
Okay.
between the first full paragraph on the page that starts some parts of North Glendale. Right after that,
Yes.
somewhere in there, I'll add a section. I think that's a good idea.
And then also to talk about this stone houses and minimal traditional type houses in the context of this time period.
Yeah, I think I already noticed that I need to rejuggle the minimal traditional, which I talk about in the post-war period, but it's
right.
more accurately
It's more
addressed
in
in the
the-
pre-war
in there.
period, and then I'll
Right.
reference it again in the
It's
post-war
like the,
period.
the precursor to the ranch.
Yeah, so I'll add that.
And then on the, this may be moot, but on page 44, where it's the theme of transportation, I don't know if you were trying to be all-encompassing when you talked about these property types associated with the theme, but wouldn't there be more like tracks and remnants of stations and...
Well, unless Commissioner Morgan or someone else
Okay,
lets us
that's
know.
the man who would-
we
could
mentioned
answer
we
this
mentioned the median.
question.
There's the median on Verdugo is still there.
Track median.
And there's the car barn at Anawalt Lumber.
Correct.
And there's a electrical substation that's outside of the city.
Unfortunately, yes.
Right, but as far as I know, that's all
it.
we've got.
That's
So-
it. There was at the very end at Pennsylvania and Montrose, there was a freight building, but it's since been torn down the last 2 or 3 years, and it's now an apartment building.
But other than, I think Chair Vidor raises a good question about tracks. I'm assuming Montrose, most of which is in the county, is the only track that was sort of designed and marketed as a streetcar suburb. Is that?
Well, there were
No, Spar Heights and
Spar Heights.
Montecito Height were marketed that way. You see a little streetcar in one of the drawings for
Oh,
that.
okay.
and other tracks that no longer exist, like Burton Heights, which was at the end of the line to Pennsylvania, and Montrose was advertised as a streetcar. You could live there. There was another one called Landon Heights, which was a little bit farther towards Montrose itself, which is now in the city of Glendale, that was advertised as a streetcar, along with area outside of this would be Rossmine was also advertised as a
Right.
streetcar. You had a mile and a half of streetcar running parallel to the Rossmine area.
Okay.
So you'll add those things then? Like
Debate,
tracks?
I guess.
Not when there's nothing today.
I
Yeah,
thought
so
there
my-
was something.
This is
I thought
where
he said
the-
there was something there. Okay.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah,
there
my
isn't.
question is really, do we have extant neighborhoods that were streetcar suburbs appropriately discussed? And I guess I'm looking, Jay, as the author of the.
Good question.
Yeah, we
that's-
have.
You feel like
the-
that's been covered?
The section 3.2 talks about residential development and suburbanization and has a section called streetcar suburbanization.
Got it.
Most of which is pulled from the LSA report for Rossmoyne, and then tailored a little bit for North Glendale in the last paragraph. But I believe, the business district of Spar Heights was put along the line, which is very typical of streetcar suburbs all around the country. And the trick is, in reality, even though these are streetcar suburbs, it's not like the main line of Philadelphia.
Right.
People had cars at the same time they were riding the streetcars, and the streetcar was dead by 1930, when some of these neighborhoods were barely even built out by 1930. So, but it was definitely part of the marketing of them. So,
Okay, so the discussion of tracks associated with transportation is actually covered under the suburbanization chapter
Yes.
section. So it is covered, just in a different location.
And the only other, this may be inappropriate for this document, but the only other thing that came to my mind was, since we're discussing all kinds of things, is there any discussion of prioritization that needs to be made in terms of what's urgent versus, less urgent, or is that not really meaningful?
I don't know if that fits into kind of a standard preservation context. In the goals section at the end, where we say a community plan survey would be a wonderful thing to have, and then we have a separate idea about a survey for the areas to enhance.
Right.
I see that as a way to
That's
pull that out as
where
a
you do
priority
it.
that's more doable short term.
Okay.
But I'm not sure where else you're thinking for priorities.
That's kind of what I was thinking. It's like, how do you wrap it all up and say, okay, well, this is a big document with a lot of things in it, and where do we put our efforts first, since we don't have money to do everything at the same time?
Yeah, I think we could shuffle goals. I'd be hesitant to prioritize the goals because they're all kind of
Right.
important in different ways. Yeah, that's the only place I really see us having a chance to do that, because ultimately this is a framework. It's a document without
Right.
conclusion. It just helps
Right.
us as we move forward for decades. So.
Exactly. It helps us prioritize. Okay. So that was it for me. So just wrapping it up, if anyone has any last words. Otherwise, I guess people will submit any additional corrections or specific typos,
Yeah, so this week would be ideal.
Errors.
Next week I can live with, and after that we won't be able to get it in before we go to planning. So read it again. Also, there's the general plan amendment sheet, which I think is pretty straightforward, but we need you to include that in
We do.
any vote that you're going to make today. And there is a motion attached to in your staff report.
Are we ready to make a motion on the community plan in the context?
And if you could add one thing, we didn't update this. The general plan amendment was kind of put in at the last minute,
Oh, so we need to amend the motion.
this should talk about the North Glendale Community Plan, the North Glendale Historic Context, and the general plan amendment for revisions to the historic preservation element.
Okay. So does somebody want to make the motion?
I will.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a motion that the Historic Preservation Commission's comments on the draft North Glendale Community Plan, on the General Plan Amendment, and the North Glendale Historic Context be forwarded to the Planning Commission for their consideration, and that the Commission's comments regarding these documents be incorporated into the final document that will be submitted to the Planning Commission review.
Second?
Second.
Roll call?
Commissioner Morgan,
Yes.
Commissioner Shire,
Yes.
Commissioner Vartanian,
Yes.
and Chairperson Vidor.
Yes. Thank you.
A momentous occasion.
And thank you very much for joining us. Great work.
Thank you.
If I may, before Laura leaves, I want to thank the Commission for recognizing the hard work that went into this. You mentioned a couple of times that it was quite the meaty thing to read. You should try writing one of these. So in terms of the context statement, I think Jay deserves a tremendous accolades for pretty much single-handedly sort of pulling that all together, as well as Christina Park, our intern, who did a lot of the footwork and research on it. And in fact, our previous intern, Manny Valenzuela, also did a decent amount of research on the tract history of this area starting 2 years ago. That was sort of helpful in wrapping our heads around North Glendale. So
No,
number of
it
staff
really-
involved in the preservation program. did
Really
great.
is an amazing set of documents, so I hope the recognition continues up the chain all the way to City Council and onward. Okay, let's go on to 7C, which is the potential designation of city-owned historic resources, reviewing a proposed list. So,
I included a list unannotated in your package, and I put together some slides just so we can all look at these city-owned properties. The idea, I think this was a harmonic convergence where I had a list going, Commissioner Vidor had mentioned the city should do this. I think everyone at various points thinks the city should take the lead in showing responsibility for historic resources that are under its ownership, and in the past has done so. So we have a number of city-owned sites like City Hall that are designated on the Glendale Register. And we put together what we can think of right now as a wish list of additional properties that the city could identify. The good news is that the director of our department, Hassan Hagani, has already spoken with department heads about just the concept of doing this, and there was pretty much openness to the idea. I can't say that everything that the commission might want to see designated will definitely be designated, because there could be all sorts of issues that kind of stand in the way. But at this point, it seems like the environment was positive, and so we can be hopeful. The goal today is to show you what we have on our list right now, to see if you agree with that list, and then to see if there are other sites that you're aware of that we've overlooked. We don't have a list, or I've never seen a list of all the properties the city owns to kind of run down and make an assessment. So most of these are kind of the big, fairly obvious ones. The gates at El Miradero being a pretty prominent one. Now, whether or not this would be a moot point, later on we'll talk about the idea of Brand Park in its entirety being listed in the way Griffith Park and Central Park and other key parks in different cities are listed. And that would then incorporate already identified landmarks like the Brand Mansion, the Tea House, and the Doctor's House, and the Miss Green Cross statue, but would also include possibly the gate, so it wouldn't need a separate designation. It would include the Brand Mausoleum, which is the very cool pyramid kind of up the canyon behind the house. So that's a possibility. If the Parks Department was not interested in the entirety of the park, we'd certainly want to identify the key historic features. But at this point, we can also look at the park as a cultural landscape, which I think is important. The Municipal Services Building has already been identified as California Register eligible, and I can't remember if it was National Register eligible also. It might be. It was certainly Glendale Register eligible. The old police building, just over here on Isabel and Wilson, is a building of real strong architectural interest, as just part of our collection of mid-century civic architecture. complementing the county courthouse building, which the city doesn't own. We don't have control over whether that would be designated or not. This also has had significant events over the years. Most civic buildings can kind of meet several criteria, not just for their architecture, but also for people and events associated with them. There are 4 libraries of interest, mid-century and beyond. The Grandview, the Casa Verdugo, the Montrose, or the La Crescenta Montrose branch, and also the Central Library by Walton Beckett Associates. There are 2 houses that or 2 structures that were recently recognized with an American Planning Association award for the city's commitment to finding solutions to put new parks into densely built-out neighborhoods without sacrificing historic buildings that are on the site that the city wanted to build the park. In the case of the bungalow up at the top that's part of the Glendale Heritage Garden, the city's original plan was to tear the house down along with 2 others on the site to create a new park. And community outcry and input from different groups helped the city change its mind, and now it's a really successful reuse for the one of the city's youth programs, as well as a beautiful park around it. And the just the Richfield Oil Station in Adams Square, which is part of the little Adams Square mini park, is also one of the few kind of car culture related buildings that we have in Glendale, and this one's in fantastic shape and was restored as kind of the centerpiece for the new park. Rockhaven, we discussed, is on most people's minds in North Glendale, people who know it as a site of really high historic importance that would extend beyond just Glendale. Without an official determination having been made, I think we could say it's a National Register eligible site. The Spar Heights Community Center was built as a community center, as well as the real estate office for the company that developed Spar Heights. And I think in the report, I was amused to find out that they gave it to the city right away. They didn't want to be responsible for it, so it was even called the community building back then. On your list, I put down GWP sites because at the point I wrote that, I didn't really have in mind. This is the one in particular that I was thinking of.
San Fernando Road.
On San Fernando. There are other sites that are definitely of architectural importance. GWP, of all city agencies, may not be as interested in, full designation of everything they own. This one really jumps out as a key, along with the Light and Power building in the Civic Center here. Right. That's kind of its parallel, built around the same time. And then something I forgot to put on the list, but should have, is the Civic Auditorium, which has gone through alterations, and I don't know the history of the alterations. On the outside, it looks close to what was originally built. On the inside, there are a lot of changes. So the integrity issues for the Civic Auditorium may or may not be an issue, but it's something I think we should definitely consider on any list that we're thinking about. And then here are the rock walls of Dunsmore Park that are mentioned in the context, and they're really, really fun. It's from one of the coolest places in Glendale. And then here's a historic overview of the Brand Park area. And we would definitely be able to talk about how other cities regulate parks, because I know it was a huge issue when Los Angeles was considering Griffith Park. Does the commission need to have purview over hiking trails or open lawn spaces or ball fields? And the answer is no, but you could identify aspects of a cultural landscape that are key features of the park so that it would be clear where your purview begins and ends in kind of an open setting like that. And I think that's it, yeah. So I'd love to hear if you have any other sites you're thinking of, or if you have any priorities among those sites or concerns about any of them.
Anybody want to comment?
I just had a quick question. How difficult would it be to put together a list of city-owned sites?
I'm sure it exists. I've never seen it. I don't know if anyone in our department has
I know
it.
that the GIS, the city's mapping system, has one of the layers or designations as city-owned properties. Mm-hmm. So we could pull up at least, the addresses and the parcel numbers and then go chasing after them. A lot of that, though, I have to say, is going to be open space parcels where there's no structure of any kind on them, because that's certain amount of property that we own as a city as that kind of parcels.
And we also have our facilities department is responsible for maintaining all of the city-owned sites, especially the ones that have buildings on them. So that might be a way to filter out some of these open parcels, and we could see if they have a list. And if we find one, you'd like us to share it with the commission, I guess?
Yeah, I would be very interested, and I think it would be helpful just to have the
No,
full
because
list.
this was really off the top of our heads, and we kind of vetted it around with everyone. And still, I forgot about the Civic Auditorium. So I'm sure there are lots of things that could be of interest.
Hidden gems.
That's right.
And one thing I forgot to ask about the other topics, and it just this topic triggered, did we get any mail from, I have to confess I didn't look on my email, but did we receive any mail on any of these issues, including this one, from the public? No? Okay. Sorry I asked. Anyone else have a comment?
Well, I do have a comment on the Montrose Crescenta Branch Library. If it goes on the Glendale Register, and the way the city was talking at one time, that the branch library would actually move down to part of the property that's Rockhaven, and the branch library itself would then be part of the fire station that there is now, how would that affect the redesign of the library, which would no longer be a library, would be part of the fire station?
If it were designated, we'd go through an advisory review process or a review process, and we don't know what they'd need to change or how it would change the building.
But that would limit the fire department's ability to use the library section of it, or?
But it's just as likely the fire department would move and the library would stay. We don't know what's going to happen
Okay.
there. So we can I think we can think about things like that, but in terms of just recognizing what buildings are of historic and architectural importance to the city, that the city's built, I think we can separate that and let the department heads share with us that
Okay.
they really don't want to see that designated, and then we'll let you guys know.
Okay. Commissioner Shire?
Yeah, no, I fully support taking a look at the city stepping forward and working on, nominating some of their own buildings. I think it's key if we are going to say in the city that historic preservation is important to us. It's a good thing for the city to say that, but to lead by example is even more critical. So, yeah, I'd love to see a list, and then if we can figure out how best to either prioritize or help the city move forward in that direction, I think it would be great.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll keep the list that we have. I'll try to get the list together for you before next month's meeting, and we'll wait until we start figuring out how we're going to sit down with various department heads to take the next step until you have a chance to look over the list.
That'd be great. If the list could include name, address, and year, that would be excellent.
See?
Yes, I wrote that down too. And also one more column. Some of these buildings, I know from the 1995 San Fernando survey that water and power was in that survey, and of course the municipal services building went through an EIR too. So if you could just do eligibility and reference any survey that they're mentioned in, that would be great. So just to close out, where does the process go from here? We come back at the next meeting and look at the detailed list, and then how does it move forward?
I assume it'll move forward at the executive level to start. We'll talk in our department, share your wishes with Hassan, and take his guidance. But he's already, like I said, he's already talked at some of their executive meetings to the department heads of the list that he saw originally, and came back telling us that there was openness to the idea. So
Great.
I think, Chair Vidor and Commissioner, I think it might be useful too, after you see the full list with the address and all the detailed information you're requesting, if the Commission has a sense of priorities or kind of favorites or preferences of which ones to pursue first, that would probably be a useful departure point.
Okay. I agree. Thank you.
And if you have any insight, for example, Commissioner Morgan, I wasn't sure if you seemed like you knew whether the Civic Auditorium had been massively remodeled or not.
It's changed. I've got a 1938 picture, and it doesn't look, it looks superficial.
Doesn't mean it's not designatable.
Right.
It's still a site where things happen, but if you could share that kind of
Yeah.
information, that would be great.
Great. Is there anything that we need to discuss or do to prepare to have the priority discussion, or should we leave that for the next meeting?
I think we should wait, and
Okay.
I'll try to get the list to you not just a week before the hearing. We'll see. If it's easily available, facilities may have something that we can
Okay.
just print out and work from, to give you a chance to kind of do some driving around and looking at some of the places.
Great.
Be great.
Okay, thank you. 7D, the May Historic Preservation Month, discussion of possible activities for May 2012.
And I see this as a ongoing item for at least several months, so we can brainstorm and think of ideas for possible events. I know Alan has an idea about an awards program that he might want to share.
Is that my cue? In the past, a number of years ago, the city planning department inaugurated the Glendale Urban Design Achievement Awards. I see Chair Vidor remembers it. One possibility is to consider including a historic preservation category as part of reinaugurating that awards program. Or having a separate preservation awards program. I think at this point there are a number of probably recognizable, worthy projects that have been completed over the past number of years that an awards program might be inclined to recognize. I think one of the questions would be, what kind of categories? Is it one preservation category? Is it, there could be a number of different kind of options or ways of sort of looking at that. Best policies, best renovation, best civic project. There's a number of possibilities. I think the commission could give some thought as to what kind of categories might be recognized and what projects might be nominatable under such categories. So.
It's great. Maybe even by area to stimulate North Glendale to do more.
Yeah, one thought, I think, when I was talking to Commissioner Vidor, kind of riffing off of what the Alex Theater already does, but thinking in terms of like what Los Angeles Conservancy does with last remaining seats, is maybe having a HPC-sponsored movie night at the Alex with a movie that may relate, whether it's Mildred Pierce, one of the few things we've got, which isn't putting us in the best light, or
It's good.
or just a film of a certain era that we can celebrate this era of Glendale and have photos of our designated landmarks that relate to that time period in the lobby. So something kind of fun like that. That could be
It's a great
kind of a
idea.
party celebration.
I watched Horrible Bosses last night. There's a chase scene on South Brand Boulevard.
It's not the family movie that Glendale.
No, definitely not.
But yeah, I'd love to hear if you have other ideas. I don't know that we can support 10 events, but I was impressed with what they did for Bike Month, which coincided with May Historic Preservation Month, where we said it's Preservation Month,
Right.
and we just
Jumped right
we
in.
haven't. I think we need to really make more of a head start. So I think having this discussion now, and next month, and for the next few months, we can start planning. And I don't know if you have ideas now, or if you want to just kind of think about it and share them next month.
I think it would be nice to, if people have ideas that we kind of make notes on them, and then we won't forget them, and we can go from there. And
Yeah, I
add
can
more
keep a
things,
running
but keep
list
a
of
running
it.
tab. So
And then we could also keep that so that in future years, if we don't do everything this year, or if we need more lead time for an idea that comes up later, we don't forget about it.
So, does anyone want to express their ideas about historic preservation?
Well, I like the idea about the Alex Theater and the historic movie, because the venue would also present itself well if we wanted to, review a few properties in each area of Glendale, to kind of bring awareness of people's own neighborhoods and what's already on the register. You could do that on the screen, prior to the movie starting, and make it kind of all encompassing. I think. Great.
Yeah, and if it's an annual event, we can keep
Yeah.
keep changing it up.
Sounds good.
Anyone else? Anything? God, I went crazy. I have like a whole list. It was like so exciting to think about actually having the commission get out there and do things. So one of the things that I thought of was that on this topic of dealing with different types of awards, that maybe we could look at the different commissions and boards and somehow, as an example, you have the Commission on the Status of Women. So, recognizing like who historically has been a prominent woman in the city who has done something, and then maybe in the design review board area, okay, well, what was a project that would fold into design review that would be historic.
Great moments in DRB history.
Great moments. Well, not so much the history, but just a project that relates to good historic restoration or something, and then whatever else we wanted to do, that type of thing, and then recognition, a special event. Well, this one may not be a great idea. A study session with other boards and commissions where we talk about what the priorities should be and kind of involve other volunteer boards and commissions in the discussion about historic preservation. And that would be a public meeting. And then wire ourselves into the events calendar in May of the rest of the city and get in everybody else's face, have a booth at an event, if there is an event going on in May, and call people's attention to Historic Preservation Month, or do something at the farmers markets that we have in town, or just plug ourselves into other events that are going on during Historic Preservation Month. Let's see, what else? Oh, and this topic, carry through on one of our projects, like this, I think, the topic of city buildings is a wonderful topic to bring forward in a high-profile way during Historic Preservation Month, because the city itself is, has so many nice historic resources that we could, I don't know how that would manifest itself, but this project could be something, we could do something with it.
Yeah, we could theoretically hold any designations until May, if that made sense, and didn't have a calendar that was like this. I know in the past the Commission has been able to designate multiple properties all at once, and since these are under the same ownership, it might be not as complicated as it sounds.
Okay.
So that's a possibility.
Okay. I think that's about it for me. So,
Before we leave that topic, Jay, would we carry this discussion into ongoing meetings under old business in addition
Yeah, I would do
so it would just be another, it would be the B item under that topic?
Yeah, it's actually similar to, our ongoing, I think we should keep it separate, though.
Yeah, I would agree.
Because it's,
But if we do that, we can continue that conversation as the commission comes
would
up
be
with new
great.
ideas.
and then eventually we'll have to decide what we want to do. Okay, so should we go on then to the Planning Division updates?
sure.
Item 8.
For this, you remember last year we talked about the changes to the Mills Act that we wanted to make, and we had been on a timeline to have that happening around this time. At first, the in-house discussion was we wanted to bring that to council after the election had occurred, rather than bring it in as a potential issue during contentious election season. In the meantime, we've come up with kind of two issues that relate to this. So we have our set of revisions to the Mills Act that needs to go to council. We also, through a project in town, and then just as a general idea, thought we might be able to add a new incentive to the Historic Preservation Ordinance to encourage people to retain existing buildings on development sites and build around them, and potentially be eligible for the Mills Act for those, for the historic building that's on the site. What we've run into is that in situations that we've seen around town, those buildings aren't always necessarily Glendale Register eligible buildings under the state status codes. They sometimes fall into a category called 6L, where a lot of our craftsman houses fell in. Most of our craftsman houses, in fact, are 6Ls. And what 6L means is that it's not eligible for the Glendale Register, but it is eligible for special consideration in planning. So the way we use that in-house is that if someone has a 6L craftsman and they come to us to get a permit to stucco it, and it's got its original wood siding, we will discourage them from stuccoing it and tell them they need to go to the design review board if they want to pursue that. But what we would do is let them take off damaged wood siding and put on maybe an artificial wood product, so they wouldn't have to necessarily restore it as if it were a designated property. Because we have so many of those 6L craftsmen, and that's kind of still one of the areas where we have most of the development pressure in single-family neighborhoods, we see an opportunity to kind of create an incentive that would allow in these situations to have the 6Ls kind of elevated to a level where the Glendale Register would apply and the Mills Act could be used for them. This, again, would be an ordinance change, and we haven't completely worked out the details, and we haven't taken this to the city attorney. But what we want to do is kind of pull all of this together so that when we go to council, we've got everything ready. The other thing we'd like to do is just to clean up, we regularly clean up ordinances for a lot of things that we do in planning. We haven't touched the preservation ordinance. I'm not sure when we have, if we have. There are, some of the language is confusing, some of the language doesn't conform to current kind of preservation practice. For example, they don't reference the Secretary of the Interior standards anywhere. A good ordinance should do that. So what I would like to do is make recommendations for kind of a full ordinance upgrade that would then tie in with the Mills Act changes and bring that to you hopefully by the August hearing with a recommended text for any changes that we'll make, and we'll work things out with the city attorney in terms of whether we can or might have trouble creating an incentive for the restoration. And one thought we had was possibly if you preserve 1, 2, 3, we don't have a number of 6L or higher properties as part of a larger development, would the new development need to be a low-income or moderate-income project, or could it be a market-rate project, just so that we have that incentive as broadly available as possible? It's not definite that this is going to happen. It's not definite. We also have to deal with people at the state level to make sure that we can use the Mills Act in the way that we're trying to. I had some preliminary talks that made it seem like it would work out, but I'm not positive. So we'd like to bring all of that to you in August and have you review it. But in the meantime, that leaves our existing Mills Act people kind of in this limbo situation where I've told people, well, by the end of the year, we're probably going to have some determination of whether you need to give us your termite report and your foundation boltings bill and what, the other things that we asked for. So rather than leave everyone in the holding pattern, my recommendation that I need your consent or to hear from you would be to process, and we only have, I think, 4, and then there's possibly a new application that's coming in this week that I would probably want to include in the group because he's making a good faith effort to get it in by the date that's on the Mills Act application. Process those applications as we have in the past without the additional requirements, because I know I can't guarantee to anyone that we're going to have resolution by November when we have to kind of have the contracts finalized. So that would be a recommendation, or we could wait and see how it goes. But the commission would have to realize that we're leaving those people in limbo, and they would need a certain amount of time, and it's going to cost a certain amount of money to do the site plan study and the photo survey, the building inspector's report, and the termite report that we're requiring. So, and I don't think we can do that without City Council's approval. So we could break that part out and go to City Council, but in-house we like to go to City Council with these kinds of policy document changes all at once. So I leave that to you to think about.
When approaching City Council on that topic, could we see if it's approved at that point that within the Mills Act contract that's granted to those homeowners or property owners, that then they have an additional year or so time frame to do those elements?
Yeah, we could build it in as a condition of the Mills Act.
Because maybe that's the way to do it, to be fair to them, give them the time they need, still get the information that we've requested and that we've all voted thinking is really critical and important going forward. But, obviously honoring the fact that we're not going to hold them up, and we'd give them, an extra year to do that.
Yeah, that's a great idea for these, what I'm thinking for the people who have filed their nominations within the first half of this year. Anyone who's sending a nomination in August or September will then hold. We'll just tell them we aren't processing your Mills Act application until the end of 2012, which is holding to our idea of also having the 1 year kind of lag between designation and enacting the tax benefits. So I think that's a great idea. That would work, definitely, and give us enough time to make sure that we get this to council, get it through to you guys, and then to council before the end of the year.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So with that, if there aren't any other comments or any other topics we need to discuss, I think we can adjourn the meeting.
Alan, we don't need a vote on something like that? The direction?
Just as an update, so I think we got direction. We'll look into that and come back next month.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the meeting is officially adjourned. Thank you.
Cool.